Hello, class. Today I'm going to look at something a little different. In fact, if you follow along with my videos, you know I have a bunch of videos. They're usually focused on architectural renderings and architectural software. But I'm going to do something a little different today. We're going to look at using Illustrator to make some fire. The reason for this, you can see on my screen, over winter break my son sort of created a game he called Fire Scorcher. It's actually much more tame than that. It's a lot like Uno, where you match colors and you match numbers. But it's more fun in many ways because I think it's a little more strategic, a little more ruthless, a little more interesting. Um, and I think the fire theme just sort of adds a little bit of interest into it as well. And I thought it'd be interesting to show. So when he did this, he sort of did sketches, and I did Illustrator work, and we printed it out. I'll put a link at the bottom of the video. You can go if you want to purchase the game. You can. You don't have to. I think it is fun, but you don't have to. But I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this, so I tried to figure out how to make some fire in Illustrator. The game has 72 cards. Yes, 72, 20 more than 52. And so I needed to develop something that I could sort of use a lot and pretty quickly, and also work with sort of the abstract theme. You can see that there's different colors because that's part of the gameplay. Is important to have different colors and things, and different amounts of fire for the way the cards sort of relevance important to the game. So I did, although fire is not something I typically do as an architect, the drawing style in terms of developing a strategy that is applicable many times over, and once you do it once becomes easy to use. That's very much in keeping with a lot of my other videos. So I will show you how to do this. There is a lot of steps. There's a lot of steps to doing it, but once you get it, I was able to sort of produce all these cards. So if you need fire, go ahead and do it. Now I do know there are other videos out there on YouTube that also show how to do fire. They might even look better than mine, but they did take sort of, you had to do a lot of drawing, and again, for 72 cards, it wasn't what I needed. So if you need to make a lot of sort of fire, maybe even abstract it a little bit like I did for the colors, this is the way to go. All right, so that was a long intro, but let's get going. Here's a just have a blank Illustrator file. I set up my card. I set this up about 3 by 4 inches, which is basically the start of some of these cards that I was working with. Of course, any size and any detailing, any colors, you can adjust any of the settings that might suit you, and it's really about the theme of how this sort of all goes together. So I'm going to start with no stroke, just for simplicity's sake, to show you the various steps. So I'm going to turn the stroke off, and I'm going to go here, and I'll set my first color. It's going to take a lot of strokes and fills on one object here. I'm going to set the first one to red. In fact, that's not even quite fully all the way over to red. So let me go. Going to really set that to red. And I'm going to start. You could start with a box. I'm going to start with a rough sort of flame shape. You'll see we'll be able to adjust this at the end, which is the great part about this method. So I will go ahead and make this shape and stretch it out a little bit to fill the page, I guess. Even overhanging the page, sometimes is a useful trick. So I'll just start with that, but we can start to any shape, and again, the great thing about this process is you can change the shape to get you'll get different flames based on this rough shape that you've drawn by the end, and that's what allowed me to make many cards out of this, and it makes it useful for many situations. So I'm going to do this in this one fill. So most of the fills and both the strokes are going to be very similar to each other, but they all have a lot in one thing. And so if you're not familiar with the appearance toolbox, you'll note that we can actually select the fill, and we can add a bunch of things just to the fill. We'll be able to duplicate this over and over again and do tweaks as we need to. So I'm going to go to appearances. I'm going to select the fill. And the first thing I am going to do is I'm going to apply Roughen. In fact, this technique uses Roughen applied several times, which makes it in many ways a lot like the way I do trees and other such things. And I encourage you to check out those other videos. But here we go. We'll go to Distort. We're going to go to Roughen. And I'll set my first settings. Again, yours might be different based on any number of factors, but this is what I used for at least one of my flames in the card deck. So I did that. I kept it 7.93. I kept it relative, and I set this first one 25.3. 2, 3, and I switched it to smooth. And you can do preview if you want to check out what it does, or you could just say OK to check out what it does. And right now it does not look like fire, but again, we're going to apply a lot of things to this yet, but it's starting to show like, oh, here's some randomness to it. That's what the good thing does. Instead of me having to draw out everything, it just sort of use this as the shape to figure out how many ins and outs there are. Now, if I go back over to this appearance, again, I can hit the little triangle here now that I've added something to this fill, and we can see that roughen is set right in there. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to do a few more, or actually several more things just to this one fill. And I probably should have started backwards because I'm doing the first, but it's going to load in the other way around. But that's okay. So we'll go. I'll keep that fill selected. I'm going to go to let's see. I'm going to go to distort and transform again, and I'm going to go to tweak. In this case, again, just because this is what I did on my card, I did 7% and I did 20% there. Oops, not 20% there, and I think I kept it relative, so I'll keep it relative and I'll say OK. And that just sort of twists things up. You can see it starts to smooth these things out a little bit. Again, we're still a long way from the fire, but we'll get there. It's getting a little closer. We can see now that that the tweak was added just to this fill right here, right in over this zone. So we're going to go to Effects again. We are going to go to Twist, which is also in the same spot, Distort, Transform. We're going to go to Twist. We're going to go to 10, and we'll say OK. And we can see it just twists it a little bit, just throws it off kilter to give these curves a little bit. You know, quite honestly, I'm doing this in the order at which the final document was made. But when I sort of invented this, I had to play with all of these things a lot, and in and out, and the twist sort of made sense at the very end to sort of make it look just the way I wanted to. It just happened to be needing to be in the middle of the setup, and so in fact there's still several more things we need to add to this. So it doesn't quite make sense in abstract, but it'll all come together in the end. So I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to go apply Roughen again, and I can just say I don't do this. You can do this. I don't do this for the video. So if you're a first-time viewer, you know, as you just say apply new effect, I'm going to apply second roughen. This is a great trick to apply multiple roughens to an object to get something to be organic. It's really useful. So I'm going to apply this again. I'm going to do different settings than the last time, though. That's sort of key to this. So I'm going to do 0.4 relative. I'm going to do 17. No, I'm going to do 12. I just have to read my handwriting I have written down beside me, so I can make this video go pretty quickly, and they'll say OK. We can see it just added a little bit of crinkles to all of these things, right? So now these are less smooth, and so it starts to add levels of detail, of ins and outs and randomness to this as we go. So now I'm going to do that. I'm going to add Roughen again, Effects, Stylize. Oops, what Stylize was, I think. I'm jumping ahead to the next round. I want to go to Roughen again and apply new effect. This one's going to be 0.4 relative. This one will be 22.71. And I'll set this to smooth and say OK. And now we can see what's happening. It's starting to get a lot of sort of flame looks in these like this one in particular I'm circling is starting to get some flames. And of course, it's also doing what flames don't do. On this side, we'll see how I solve that, at least for the cards. Which is the flames are also sort of coming down in all around in that way. And then one thing I did here was I went to Effects, the last sort of setting before I did some transparency stuff. I went to Stylize and I went to Feather, and I did 0.04 for this guy. This sort of makes the edges a little bit blurry, just like that. So you can see. So this is almost one level. Actually, the one thing I did, I technically probably don't need to do it for this first one, but a lot of times I'll set various opacities for each of these fills. In this case, I had it set to multiply over a white background, though you won't see any effect happen with that. But we will as we start to add these things up as we go. So that's the first base of the fire. Now here's the thing. I had lots of strokes and fills on top of them. Most of the additional strokes and fills are almost all the same settings we just watched here, meaning they all have roughen, they all have twist, tweak, roughen, and all these things. Most of even these settings are the same between the additional fills and strokes, though there are some, just to get a little variation here and there are some differences here and there as we go. So we'll just sort of jump to the next thing. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add more fills. And so I'm just going to select this fill. I'm going to come down here to my post-it note, which is duplicate that fill. And we can see it just literally duplicated it all exactly as I had done before. And we can see because of some of these randomness and things that are set in these things, it slightly changed the look of this. Became a little fuller also because I have two strokes. So basically, on the one difference I made to this one is I just added a film grain effect. So I'm going to go, that's a Photoshop effect. Actually, film grain is going to be under here. So it's going to be under artistic, and it's going to be under film grain. And I had did 11, 20, and 3, though, any settings you can do that. You can see it just added some texture to the fire, so it's just not so pure red in this case, and so that just, you can see what it's doing is the original one is red, if you can see on the YouTube videos, pure red, where some of it sort of has this film grain. It starts to add some detail to it that will sort of build up over time. And then what I did is I just took this and I duplicated the same thing again, and we can see it sort of begins to fall in, and there were some tweaks. So for example, I did a slightly different feather. I just increased it a little bit to change things up. We can see the resulting change. And one of the things I did on this one is I also did an outer glow as the last thing. So if I select that fill, I can go to stylize and I can go to outer glow, and I set it to sort of this dark orange color. These were the settings that I had actually used, so they're preloaded. So I did this dark sort of orange color. I did 100% in 0.16 and did OK. On that we can see it sort of starts to give this fire a bit of a glow. And I also added another texture on here just to change things up, another Photoshop texture. I did sponge. So that's under artistic. I'm going to go to sponge, and the settings I used here were 2, 12, and 5. Let that generate. It's going to obviously start to use some computer power here, but you can see that the texture starts to add more detail to it there as well. And then I took this guy and I duplicated him again, so I think that's the fourth red fill I've got with most all of these same settings. So there we go. But this time I actually took off a lot of things. So I took off the film grain. I just select it there and then delete it. I had no sponge. I took off all the texture basically. Took off the sponge there. And I took off the feather even on this one. There we go. And what I added to this, and I'm going to have to do a little tweak here. So I'm going to select this guy up top. I added an inner glow to him. So I'm going to stylize inner glow. I'm going to keep it white, and I'm going to keep all these settings as they are. I'm going to say OK. I'll let this run here. Let's see how it goes there. And I changed this settings here as well. I kept outer glow. Actually, I put outer glow, so inner glow has to come before outer glow. So I have to just pull this up into the settings. Actually, we can see that's why that line sort of was out here, because it's on the outside the outer glow. When I move inner glow above it, we can see now it's just sort of making the ends of these tips a little bit brighter as we go there. And I changed the opacity. So I actually no longer have it set to multiply. I have it set to normal. And it's going to have to pause it here while it renders. There we go. So now you can really see the white line there in the outer glow. But I did take down the transparency fairly low to 44%. So there we go. So that was sort of the effect. You can sort of see it's starting to sort of layer up the fire to give it some depth and other such things. But right now it's still all red. but it is sort of the base I used. After this, what I did is I added a few more fills and strokes, and in these I add different colors to them to start to get the vibrancy of colors. And certainly my fire is a bit abstract, but I think if you played with this and added the variety of colors, it might even look more realistic. You might be able to do it better than I do. So I'm going to duplicate this. Actually, I'm going to, never mind. Don't duplicate the one I just duplicated. I'm going to delete that guy just by hitting the thing, the trash can. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to this first one because this next fill is a lot like the first one, just a different color. So I didn't need all the extra textures and stuff that I've sort of developed. So I'm going to hit the post-it note, but I am going to take this guy and then just drag him all the way to the top. All right, so now I've got at the top one very much like the first one. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color first off to a yellow. Again, you can spend time picking the right colors that you want to pick, but I'll just start with yellow. And we don't see much happening because of the multiply setting that I currently have here. So just show what I'm doing, why don't I just turn off multiply and go to normal for now. In fact, this layer will stay at normal, but now you can see the yellow a lot better. We will add transparency to it at the end of this process. But essentially, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pretty much keep all these settings the same. Actually, in the original one I actually did change this slightly to 0.3. I doubt that has a significant difference, but why don't I change the feather to 0.3 since that's what I did. And the one thing I did do is I used transform on this thing. So I'm going to select the fill here, go to effects, distort transform, and go to transform. And what I did is I changed these top numbers on the scale a little bit. And we'll see if we hit preview, what it does is, once it thinks here, see, it just sort of shrinks it all because it's sort of under the premise that the fire is brighter more towards the center. Rather than, and it sort of changes colors and gets darker towards the edges. So that's why I take a bright color and then I sort of shrink it in towards the center. That was sort of the point of that. But and then what I did do is I did change the opacity. I kept this to normal, but I changed the opacity down pretty far. In this case, I was using 36, but 36, the exact number, doesn't matter. We can see there it sort of softens it up a lot. All right, and then for the remaining moves of what I did here is I actually added a couple strokes. I'm going to have to redo a lot of these things all the same because a lot of the settings are the same, but to do strokes I'll have to redo them. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to set the stroke to white. And you'll see how this happens. It's sort of interesting because now we see this white stroke, and I actually had a thickness of the stroke that was more along the lines of 0.3 in this case, so it's going to get thicker here. And I have to go and add very much the same thing. So I'm going to select this stroke. I'll open it up so we can see it as we work. But I'm going to go to effects. I'm going to go just transform. I'm going to go to Roughen. In the very first Roughen, I'm going to apply the same settings that I did on the first one, which was 7.93 followed by 25.23, and I smoothed it out and said OK. I should have added that sponge at the end so it didn't have to generate every time, but so be it. Then I'm going to tweak and twist this. So first tweak them, do the exact same settings I did the first time, 7%. They don't necessarily have to be the same. It was just I had them written down so it becomes easy to do that way. See, it sort of gets it all nice and scribbly. It's sort of fun. I mean, I sort of like this effect. It's not what my final effect was, but it's sort of interesting how these things can add up and produce interesting results for you. So I'm going to twist it 10 degrees. Then I'm going to add a couple more things of Roughen, just like before. Distort, transform, apply new effect. Yep, go ahead and apply new effect. 0.4 relative 12.61 smooth. OK. And effect, distort, transform, Roughen, apply new effect. Again, 0.4 relative 22.71 smooth. Okay. And then we are going to feather it. Stylize, feather. 0.03, I think mine might have been 0.04, but the difference in there is minimal. So we'll do that. Ooh, look at that sort of spiderwebby looking thing coming along here. All right. So now the trick to this is sort of along the same thing as the sort of yellow, which is the white areas don't necessarily go out to the edges, so we're going to apply a unique transform to this. So we go to Effects, Distort Transform, Transform. In this case, I kept that at 100, set this down to about 2/3. I kept the horizontal the same, but in this case I even moved it down. So by doing 0.2257 here, what it's going to do is, we'll let this generate here, sort of squishes it down like that, so it moves it down closer to the base where the white might happen. Of course, I'm going to play with the opacity as well because it's still too strong, so I'll set this down to 73%. 75 probably also works. And I'm going to change the blending mode here once it renders to overlay. There we go. So, and you can see now when I set it to overlay, what it's doing is the white areas are really enhancing the colors below. So I start to get these sort of bright spots out of the fire. All right, so I did that stroke. And believe it or not, there's just one more stroke. So I'm going to, since it's mostly the same, I'm going to start with this stroke and I'm just going to duplicate it. And the one that I did, I set the top stroke all the way to sort of a bright orange color. I'll use that one. I'm sure it's probably fine. Didn't write down the exact values of the colors, but all of this is flexible. So again, just like before, a lot of these are all the same. However, I did add a film grain to this one. So let me go to Effects, Artistic Film Grain. And in this one I did 11, 20, and 3. And I changed the opacities and blending modes a little bit. So I set this one down to 60 for opacity, and I also changed this from overlay to screen. There we go. We can see again, it just sort of, that one with orange, it sort of brightens it up and gets these bright spots. So for the most part, this was how I created the fire. So I had 2 strokes, 1 orange, 1 white, 4 red fills, and 1 yellow fill in this order. Obviously, each one has a bunch of things happening right inside of it. We can see that's basically what the fire is that looks like. Again, the great thing the reason why it worked well for me, well, one reason, there were a few for the game, is I could take any one of these points, for example, and I could pull this up. And because a lot of these roughens are all based on the shape, it all changes the way that this fire looks like, and I can generate a lot of different looks of fire. And you can see this was a trick I sort of figured out as I was going along. The more pointy this shape is, quite often, the more you might start to get some flames, and you sort of work it out in sort of interesting ways to see how you might be able to even get like a shoot off of a flame, sort of almost looking like it's peeking off. Not so much here. There's a little one sort of happening right there, for example, and really produces a nice effect. Now, if you want to fill in the base to have more solid color, because usually fire is not floating in the air, shooting from all sides. Although in Fire Scorcher, there might be points where that happens. What I did there is I just took like a rectangle base, and sort of existed outside my drawings. And you start it at red or whatever. In the game, I actually did use pure colors for the base because I added notes of gameplay underneath them. But what I did is I can just arrange them and send them to the back or put them on a different layer. And you can see it sort of blends into the fire. So if my edge of the page is here, it starts to look pretty good. What you can really do is you can actually add the same effects to this guy and sort of pull them out as one approach. Or, whoops, did not mean to delete my fire. That was an accident. Or the other thing you can do is, of course, if it works for you in terms of scale and the way the drawing is being set up. Like in this case, if the fire is just going to go off the page, you could just scale the bottom right off the page so that the solid area hits the bottom of your drawing. And then you could also use crop, right? So there we go. So now we sort of don't see the fire. Sort of really has this reaching effect. And you could always, like I said, you could also use crop, clipping mask, other ways to cut off the areas you don't want to see. So so that is how I did fire. It took 25 minutes. That's a long video for me, but I think it's fun. Again, I don't know. Fire is not good for architecture. We architects do spend so much money trying to make sure that their buildings do not burn. But maybe some other people out there will find this interesting and use it as an interesting graphic style. And if you are interested in the game, I'll put the link at the bottom of this video. You can purchase the game. It's a lot of fun, but you don't have to. Just keep on drawing. Thanks. Have fun.